All right, so I'm going to do this again. Dear Portugal, expression of interest. This is part 5, contemporaneous notice to institutions, HRTO, and others. So this submission addresses the documentary record, proving that my attempt to seek safety through relocation was disclosed contemporaneously into formal channels and was not created after the fact. In November of 2021, I prepared an expression of interest letter titled Dear Portugal, describing the circumstances that made relocation necessary. These were life-saving conditions. They included repeated failures of protection, exposure to unstoppable harm, and the collapse of meaningful domestic remedies. The letter was intended to document my request for a lawful, safety-based relocation pathway to Portugal where I could access doctors within a 2-day window, and it took me 8 years to find one in Canada. On December 8th, 2021, I circulated a package titled Held Hostage by Canada Seeking Asylum in Portugal and my expression of interest for Portugal. I copied the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario registrar, among others. An HRTO registrar reply is captured in the same email record, and this proves the Portugal safety relocation recorded existed in real time in 2021. Institutional actors were on notice and updated since 2018 regarding the unstoppable harm. The subsequent narrative of instability, displacement, and exposure cannot be dismissed as retrospective invention. This is important because later events were repeatedly reframed as isolated conflict rather than predictable continuation of a documented safety trajectory. The government cannot credibly claim ignorance when formal notice was provided in 2018, 2019, 2020, and then 2021, and every year since. The only remaining question is whether the state chooses to treat notice as a trigger for protection or as administrative nuisance to be procedurally filtered until the applicant collapses. The next submission will address the 2022 displacement sequence, including witness evidence, eviction enforcement, and the transition into the next housing environment that further increased vulnerability. So here's part 6. Subject is 2022 displacement during active proceedings with witness evidence, eviction enforcement, and increased exposure. This submission addresses the 2022 displacement sequence and why it constitutes a governance failure, repeated destabilization while active complaints, and evidence were already on record. In 2022, while I had ongoing legal tribunal matters and was attempting to secure remedies, I was displaced from housing in London, Ontario. This was not a quiet move. It involved formal enforcement steps and contemporaneous evidence submissions, even though the court was in my favor. I filed a great deal of evidence. Nothing was speculative. It showed a woman running me over with her vehicle down a driveway and committing 7 acts of hate against murdered and missing Indigenous women, red dress. It is documented. It was publicly available, and they continued with enforcement and lack of protection. 2 independent witness statements were produced and submitted into the record during this period. These statements corroborated a pattern of intimidation, interference, targeting, and were transmitted through formal channels, including tribunal evidence submission. This evidentiary trail is important because it demonstrates the concerns were not merely asserted, they were supported and communicated. Shortly thereafter, eviction informants proceeded within 7 days without cause. The result was predictable and severe: loss of stability, heightened risk, and reduced ability to preserve evidence or maintain safe access to justice. The public interest issue is clear. When a person is displaced during active proceedings, the system must treat that displacement as a risk factor requiring protection and coordination, not as a reason to narrow or dismiss the person's claims. Instead, fragmentation continued. Multiple bodies, partial jurisdiction, procedural throttling, and not our role responses. That combination functions as a pipeline from complaint, displacement, vulnerability, to further harm. I'll repeat that. That combination functions as a pipeline from a complaint to displacement to vulnerability to further harm. This has happened 4 times with active proceedings. It's no longer a coincidence. The state is enabling the destruction of witnesses and whistleblowers. The next submission will address the transition into the next housing arrangement and why pre-existing relationship and knowledge matters when later actors claim they were unaware of vulnerability and risk. Part 7. Pre-existing relationship with Carrie Oliver, foreseeability, and the witness to house gatekeeper pivot. This submission addresses a recurring structural problem. When a person first appears as a supportive witness or ally and later becomes a housing gatekeeper or complainant, the system must treat knowledge and foreseeability as central, not optional. My relationship with Carrie Oliver began before any tenancy, during a period when I was documenting danger, displacement, and the need to leave Canada for safety. She had direct awareness of my current circumstances and my vulnerability. The pre-existing relationship matters because it defeats her later attempts to reframe events as a simple landlord-tenant dispute between strangers. When a person with prior knowledge later occupies a position of control over housing, access to shelter, or reporting mechanisms, the risk of coercive leverage increases dramatically. In that situation, de-escalation does not necessarily resolve conflict because the conflict can be used instrumentally to create outcomes, removal, isolation, or reputational harm. The system typically ignores this dynamic and treats each new housing failure as an isolated interpersonal breakdown. That approach is administratively convenient, but it is factually and ethically inadequate. It allows power holders to exploit vulnerability while claiming innocence. This is not a request for the Prime Minister to adjudicate private disputes. It is a request to recognize the governance failure. Repeated displacement with known vulnerability and repeated institutional notice creates foreseeable harm that the state has a responsibility to prevent. The next submission will address retaliatory criminalization, how conflict is converted into criminal exposure after rights assertion, and why this demands urgent oversight and protection of the witness. All right, so part 8, this is on retaliatory criminalization after rights assertion and my attempts to criminalize Carrie Oliver and the abusive process risk in Sault Ste. Marie. This submission addresses a critical escalation. The conversation of housing and rights disputes into criminal exposure through retaliatory complaints for screaming for help, procedural imbalance, and institutional pass-through. In my experience, when I asserted rights or attempted to hold others accountable, the response was not resolution. It was escalation into criminal jeopardy. This is a well-known pattern in power imbalance disputes. The person seeking help is reframed as the problem, and the state's enforcement tools are used to impose silence, remove them from housing, and discredit them as a complainant. The mechanism is very straightforward. A vulnerable person seeks remedies, tribunal, court, complaint. The opposing party responds with counter-allegation. Institutions treat the counter-allegation as presumptively credible. The original complainant is burdened with conditions, stigma, and procedural restraints. The result is removal and isolation, often before the original wrongdoing is adjudicated. I am currently facing a criminal harassment allegation tied to the act of seeking help and attempting to pursue accountability. The concern is not simply that an allegation was made. The concern is that this criminalization operates as an end run around administrative accountability, producing the same outcome as eviction, displacement, and exposure. This is precisely why oversight is required. When criminal process is used, intentionally or by structural default, to neutralize a complaint during active proceedings, the integrity of justice is compromised. The next submission will address current conditions and why ongoing instability while litigation continues and access to justice emergency requires immediate federal attention.